Welcome in. Hope you're doing well. It's been a while. Nice to see you. I feel like I probably have some explaining to do of like, hey, where have you been the last couple months? I think around February or March of this year, I just stopped the daily live show cold turkey. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But I do want to say that I think the time away from a daily morning reactionary show to the news of the day was helpful. It helped kind of reorganize my priorities and what I'm trying to convey to all of you wonderful folks. And so for that, I think we're in a better spot going forward. I don't think this is going to be a daily thing. At least I know it's not going to be a daily thing. But my hope is that this show is now a little bit more thought out, a little bit more structured, and kind of less just rambly reaction stuff as I was doing, and I think too many people are doing. So with that, let's get into it. Thanks for coming back. First segment, the Trump guilty verdict. Now, obviously, if you don't live under a rock, you are aware that Donald Trump was found guilty on 34 felony counts of, well, nobody actually really knows what of, and that's kind of the whole basis of what we're going to talk about. On Thursday, the jury came back in the Manhattan trial with DA Alvin Bragg, who ran on getting Trump. Show me the man, I'll show you the crime. And they found him guilty of all of the things that the prosecution was seeking in that particular case. None of that should be new information to you. Now, there are a couple things that I feel like we should talk about. First, I want to get to this brief outline of what it is and kind of explain why I think a lot of conservatives aren't really worried about that. Probably most notably and pretty immediately after, my friend Charlie Kirk tweeted, hey, look, this signifies something. It'll get thrown out on appeal, which I think it will, and he believes it will. And for that, we're not super concerned about this particular instance. But I think he was talking about, and what I'd like to talk about, is the overall broad idea of what this actually means. Before we get to that, let's briefly explain what happened and why it's so crazy. Now, I'll say this at the onset, and I'm stealing this from Ron DeSantis. Nobody is above the law, and nobody's below the law, meaning that you can't contort the law to make something or someone a criminal by way of maneuvering the law around in order to find that person guilty, which is, I think, exactly what a lot of people think happened with Donald Trump. Partly because what he was charged with, the judge in the trial, the gag orders, the media attention, the jury, where he was being charged, all of that stuff. Now, I'm assuming that you've heard a lot about Judge Merchan, who randomly has gotten a lot of the Trump trials, a lot of the cases involving Donald Trump. His daughter also worked for big-time Democrats and was paid a lot of money. Kind of seems like a conflict of interest. Kind of seems like exactly what they're accusing of Justice Alito of. But we'll talk about that in a later segment, the whole flag theory nonsense. But I think the big thing that not enough people are talking about are the charges themselves. I talked a little bit about this on Instagram and wanted to give, I guess, some of my insight as a person who has worked in politics for a very long time. I hate qualifiers. I hate saying, as a political consultant. But in this case, it makes sense. As a person who has worked in politics for a very long time, I will tell you this. Everybody I know, without exception, has run afoul of some sort of election compliance law. What I mean by that is the election laws oftentimes are so convoluted, so difficult to understand, and so easy to screw up given the paperwork that you're filling out and filing with the Federal Elections Commission, the FPPC in California, whatever your state's election regulation body is. It's so easy to screw that up. It happens to everybody. And I'm not trying to make light of it, but in most cases, it's kind of an accident. It's kind of like, you get pulled over on the freeway or on a road And the officer says, hey, you were going 60 miles an hour in a 45. And you're like, oh, shoot, sorry, I didn't even know that I was doing that. I wasn't aware. I live in California. Nobody gets in trouble for anything. I assumed that this was legal. It kind of has that kind of vibe. Everybody I know has run afoul of campaign finance violations, including all the way up to Obama. So what I'm trying to say here is that misfiling paperwork, while I'm not excusing it, I'm not saying it's okay to misfile your paperwork, it happens kind of a lot. And generally speaking, it is not a big deal to misfile your paperwork. And that's what this really comes down to. If you're doing, I heard somebody describing this as Trump checked the wrong box in his TurboTax filing of like what he paid Stormy Daniels under. Now, quick caveat, and again, I'm sure you've heard this before, the media and the entire intelligentsia class has been saying this is the hush money trial. It is not. That literally has nothing to do with it. Paying off somebody, while I believe is probably not the right thing to do from a moral standpoint, to talk, especially if you're having an affair with them and you don't want that affair to come to the public light and you want them to keep quiet, while I would probably disagree with that on a moral standpoint, not illegal. So the whole idea of calling it a hush money trial is ridiculous and stupid in and of itself. So the hush money part of it has kind of nothing to do with this except the fact that when filing the campaign contributions, Trump or whoever's accountant was marked it as, this is legal expenses, which caveat on caveat on caveat. If I were paying off a porn star that I was having an affair with, and I didn't want that person to keep quiet, what box do you check? Do you check off paying porn star that you had an affair with? No, you probably would rightly categorize it as a business expense or a legal expense. But the whole again, I don't want to re-explain the entirety of the case. I'm making my way to a point here. But the idea is that Michael Cohen paid off Stormy Daniels to keep her mouth shut, and then Trump, in paying Cohen back for the quote-unquote hush money, well, I guess it is actually hush money, but again, that's not illegal, marked it as a legal expense. Okay, fine. All of that, I guess, happened. I am of the belief that Donald Trump did have an affair with Stormy Daniels, even though I think he probably is denying it at this point, or continuing to deny it. But at the end of the day, I think all of that stuff happened, and probably, maybe, a campaign violation was committed. The question is, how big of a deal is that? The federal government, by the way, did not think it was a big deal. So instead, the DA in Manhattan, Alvin Bragg, decided to prosecute in his state a federal crime that accounts for a misdemeanor. All of these things I'm sure you've heard. But this is what I think is being talked about the least and matters the most. So Alvin Bragg charges Donald Trump with a misdemeanor crime. Well, it's not a misdemeanor, it's a felony. It's 34 counts of a felony. Okay, well, again, as a person who has run afoul of these same laws and, you pay a fine for it, again, including Obama paid a fine for misfiling campaign paperwork, which is, again, not condoning that, but also it happens. You get caught speeding, you blow a stop sign, or you roll through a stop sign. I don't know, things aren't that big of a deal. So Alvin Bragg takes these misdemeanor crimes and bumps them up to a felony. Well, then the question becomes, well, how did they bump them up to a felony? This is the thing that I think people have talked about but aren't talking enough about. Well, the reason he bumped it up to a felony is that the claim from the prosecution was, well, it is a misdemeanor to falsify business records, in this case, campaign finance disclaimers. It is a misdemeanor, but in this particular case, it is elevated to a felony because the misdemeanor in question was only committed to cover up another pre-existing or attempt to commit another crime. In other words, and more plainly put, it's only a felony because they're saying that the paperwork filing was trying to secretly hide another crime. Okay, fine. I understand that legal theory. Don't you think, though, then, if your crime is being elevated from a misdemeanor to a felony, because the suggestion is that you were attempting to cover up another crime, don't you think that other crime should be made public? Don't you think that the supposed other crime that elevated this to a felony should be told to the defense? Put yourself in those shoes. If you were being tried for a crime, a misdemeanor crime, I don't know, who cares what it is, and they say, well, it's no longer a misdemeanor, it's actually a felony because you only committed this misdemeanor infraction because you were attempting to hide another crime, you probably would want to know, okay, well, what was the other crime that you're accusing me of? Not being convicted of, not being even charged with, but accusing me of. Well, they said, well, we're not going to tell you. Wouldn't you also go, wait a minute, my crime is being elevated to the next level of severity, but you won't tell me why that is? Yeah, isn't that a problem? This is one of the big reasons I think why a lot of conservatives aren't super concerned about this. They think, or they know, hopefully it'll be thrown out on appeal. The question is, when will the appeal happen? Most people think the appeal at that particular New York State level won't happen until after the election. Some people think the Supreme Court is going to come in and say, well, we have to decide this because states could eventually start taking Trump off the ballots because they don't allow for quote-unquote convicted felons to vote or run for president, or at least I've been told by several other people. So if that's the case, then the Supreme Court could expedite the appeal. But the bottom line is, the Sixth Amendment of the Constitution is pretty clear that in order to be charged with the crime, you have to know in specific detail what that crime is. As a matter of fact, that was part of the reason we formed this whole country. The colonies, in addition to being taxed without representation, were in many cases, if they were deemed quote-unquote troublemakers in the colonies, brought before the king on trumped-up charges, not told what they were being charged with, and then were thrown in jail or punished for the crimes that they weren't really even sure would happen. The whole idea of this country is based on the fact that justice is a thing, and you can only achieve justice if the person in defense is fully aware of the crime that they're being charged with. You know, take out the layers of escalating a crime to the next level of severity, and you have a situation where somebody's in a courtroom and the judge is saying, well, you're being charged. And you ask, well, with what? What did I do? I'm not sure. And I'd like to mount my defense based on knowing what I did or what you claim that I did. And they say, nope, you can't know. And then the jury votes, are you guilty or are you not guilty? And you're sitting there going, I don't even know what I did wrong. I feel a lot of that. I feel that way when something gets taken down from social media, Facebook or YouTube, but that's, again, beside the point. But the bottom line is, I think it's going to get thrown out on appeal because of that reason specifically, because the elevation of the misdemeanor crime to the felony level, the fact that Alvin Bragg prosecuted a federal crime in the states, the fact that the judge, all of that stuff being said, I am not concerned that this is going to actually be able to hold its water at the end of the day. Couple things I want to point out here too. I said this on some forum, I don't know, that while I think it is justified that a lot of conservatives are up in arms, rhetorically speaking, about the fact that Trump is now a felon, saying, I'm going to vote for a felon and making light about this, I would caution us against making light of the use of the term felon. Because of all the reasons I just explained, I don't think Trump will actually be a felon in terms of being a convicted person of a crime. I think that'll get thrown out on appeal and he will no longer be a felon. And so what I would caution us against doing is calling him a felon and, in effect, glorifying that term, because at the end of the day, remember, we are the side of law and order and justice. We don't want to be in the position where we are making light of a real term that has real implications and that actually means something. And even more than that, we don't want the lefties to conflate our use of the term felon and then say, well, your morals are just as relative as ours because you're saying being a felon is good now. That's the last thing I think we want ultimately. So at the end of the day, let's hold off on being so, hooray, we're voting for a felon, even though I know it doesn't change anything in our minds. That's what I'd like to hold off on. The second thing I'd love to talk about here is, what did this actually do? If I were a Democrat strategist and I was trying to plot a path to victory in November of 2024, especially to the White House, do I think that this helped or hurt my particular objective? Again, if I'm a Democrat and I'm trying to get Joe Biden reelected, what happened here? In other words, did anybody change their mind about this? The answer, I think, is absolutely not. I think the people that were already going to vote for Trump are still going to vote for Trump, and the people that weren't going to vote for Trump aren't going to vote for Trump still. There was some poll, I forget who it was, but it was like 15% of people said that this is going to affect my disdain or whatever for Donald Trump. And my thought is, okay, well, that means 85% of people say that, well, it won't affect that. And also, who are those 15% of people? Are they people that already hated Donald Trump and now that he is, quote unquote, a convicted felon, hate him more? Okay, well, that poll then does nothing for us. Did it actually help the Democrat side putting their opponent in jail? Or did it hurt their political case? I would argue that it hurt their political case. It isn't even a wash. I think conservatives / Republicans are rallying behind a guy that even if they don't really like him, and I've been open in saying this, I think it would have been easier to win with another Republican candidate who wasn't Donald Trump. But you don't get to choose your heroes. Somebody said that, and I'm stealing that. But at the end of the day, you don't get to choose who your heroes may be. And like it or not, whether you agree with this term or not, Donald Trump, by default, being the guy who stood up to the people who are willing to pervert justice, is in fact now the hero of this story, whether you like it or not. The last question that we have to answer to ourselves is, as a whole of society, was it worth it? Was the political prosecution, which I believe it is, and I think a majority of the country believes it is, worth the turmoil that this is going to cause going forward? Because it should be obvious and it should be apparent that a lot of people on the conservative side of the aisle, the Republican side of the aisle, who have not played dirty, for lack of a better term, for a long time, are now looking at this going, this crosses a line. This is Caesar crossing the Rubicon headed back into Rome. This is a monumental shift in the way that we do things. And because of that, why not lock her up, as people so fervently chanted in 2016, only to have Donald Trump, after he was president, say, we're not going to do anything about that. Why not? And the question now has a lot more validity considering the fact that, well, they just did it. Why wouldn't, let's just say, I don't know, give me some red city that Joe Biden gave a speech at 30 years ago. Why wouldn't that district attorney say, well, Joe Biden mislabeled his campaign finance, invoice when he gave this speech and was making this amount of money? Why not? Again, I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think that's a good road for us to go down in this tit-for-tat world, but it's getting more and more difficult to make the argument as to why we shouldn't. If they're going to do it to people on our side, and do it to a person at that level, who's to say they won't do it to you? And if you need to eliminate your concern of it happening to you, wouldn't you want to have it happen to the other side too? Again, I'm not making the argument for it. I'm just saying it's becoming increasingly more difficult to make the argument of not playing at their level, which again is a bad place to be in America. For the next segment, would like to take a moment to say I appreciate you for watching this, wherever you may be watching or listening to this. If you wouldn't mind going to whatever platform you're watching or listening on, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, Facebook, any of the other platforms, if you wouldn't mind going and giving a little like button wherever that might be on your given platform, or leaving a comment, or if you're listening to on a podcast platform, a 5-star review would be super helpful if you enjoy watching whatever it is that we're doing. If you don't, keep your comments to yourself. We don't want to hear them. Just scroll right through if you don't appreciate a smart aleck making wisecracks and dumb commentary about the news. But if you do, again, appreciate you taking in this content on whatever platform you may be doing it on. And with that, we'll get back to it. Segment 2. Happy Pride to all who celebrate in Gaza. There's a lot of stuff going on in terms of the Israel-Hamas war. I feel like we should talk about it, feel like we should dive in, because in the last week, a lot of things happened that I feel like should be talked about. The president gave a speech, which we'll get into in just a second, but also several countries came out recently and said that Palestine should be a recognized state. Specifically, Spain, Norway, and Ireland recognized Palestine as a nation state, which brings some questions. Now, I haven't really talked, obviously, a ton, especially recently, about the Israeli-Hamas war, which I think is what you should call it. I don't think you should call it the Israeli-Palestine war for lots of other reasons that we won't need to get into right now. But remember, Israel's fighting a terrorist organization. And you can argue over what kind of funding the U.S. should give them. You can argue over a bunch of the different nuances in it. But overall, remember, there's a country with Western values in which all people are respected equally, and then there's a terrorist organization. And if you have trouble deciding which sides of those to pick, I don't know what to tell you. And like I said, if you really are struggling there, especially if you're part of the alphabet community, keep in mind that the alphabet community in that part of the world, Gaza, and in the West Bank, and really in all of the Middle East, is not as accepted as you might think, which shouldn't need to be stated, but is just reality. But back to the point of, and I think that there's a small point to be made here, but back to the idea of these several states, nation states, now saying, well, Palestine needs to be recognized as its own country. We, as a country, are going to recognize them. There's some issues with that. Like I said, what countries were those? Spain, Norway, and Ireland recently recognized Palestine as a nation state. The main point, the main question that needs to be asked here is, what changed? Because prior to that, those countries did not recognize Palestine as its own nation state. And by Palestine in this particular situation, I think we mean the West Bank, and I think we mean Gaza. To be honest with you, I didn't really try and figure out which side they were talking about, either the West Bank or the Gaza Strip. But I think it overall is kind of the same thing. If you're going to recognize them as a nation state, what changed? What changed in your view if you weren't doing it before and now you're going to do it? Was it the fact that October 7th, the horrible atrocities committed by Hamas, were justified in your mind? Do you think that it made so much of a difference that now you're willing to say, oh, the Palestinian regions, Gaza and the West Bank, are now recognized by us? In other words, did Hamas's attack that killed 1,500 people on October 7th work? Is that what you're doing? Are you giving them credit? Which is a weird position to be in, especially for countries who call themselves civilized Western countries, to then recognize a nation state that is quote-unquote Palestine, and again, I don't know what their definition of that is, to say, well, we now recognize that as a state would inherently then mean that something changed. And then if it inherently means that something changed, you have to ask yourself, what changed? Well, an unwarranted attack on innocent civilians that killed 1,500 people, that changed. That's really kind of the big thing that changed. And if that's the thing if that was the catalyst that changed your mind, what does that say about you? Imagine, if you will, a situation in which, I don't know, let's just make up a person's name, John Hinckley. I don't know, let's make up a name. He's trying to impress somebody named, another made-up person, Jodie Foster. And he wrote letters to this Jodie Foster saying, please accept me. This made-up person, John Hinckley, is Palestine in this situation. And all of these other Western countries will categorize as this made-up person named Jodie Foster. And this guy, John Hinckley, writes letters, just a ton of letters to this Jodie Foster person, and she says no. Well, she doesn't say no, she just ignores it because this was an unhinged person. And so then this made-up character named John Hinckley says, well, I know what'll get this star actress's attention. I will attempt to assassinate the President of the United States of America. And then he goes off and tries to do that. And fortunately, thank God, is unsuccessful. And imagine then, if you will, Jodie Foster, this made-up person that represents the Western states that now are saying, well, we should recognize Palestine as a country, and Palestine being represented by this guy, made-up John Hinckley, then says, wow, this atrocity that you committed sure has gotten my attention. Maybe I'll give this guy a try. Maybe he is the one for me. Now that I have been made aware of the lengths that he would go to swoon me, that maybe then is, maybe now is the time that I finally give this guy a shot. Go on a date with him. Because this can't be a horrible way to justify horrendous actions at all whatsoever. But I think that's what this situation is like. It really, there's a lot of parallels here. If you look at the representatives of this allegory, if you will, it would appear that the countries that didn't accept Palestine as a nation state beforehand, who are now willing to do so, are doing so because something changed, and the thing that changed was a horrific attack. And if horrific attacks work, well, don't we have a much bigger problem on our hands? But that's the rest of the world. That's what happened over the last, I don't know, week or so. But I think what's really interesting is a speech that Joe Biden gave on this new kind of deal, which seems to be up in the air. I don't know enough about the internal Israeli decision-making to figure out if the headlines that Israel accepts this new Joe Biden deal, we're just waiting on Hamas. I don't know if that's like an actual acceptance or a calling Hamas's bluff, because every deal that's been put on the table, which obviously includes releasing all of the hostages, Hamas has fervently denied, because it doesn't take a genius to point out the fact that they're not interested in a deal. But anyways, I don't know. What I'm saying is I don't know the strategy going on, obviously, in Israeli internal decision-making. But Joe Biden put together this proposal in which he said two things that I think are incompatible with each other. One, he said Israel has the right to defend itself, which I agree with. And two, he also said that Hamas does not have the ability to pull off another October 7th. And he's using that as a platform in which to try and broker this new ceasefire agreement. Which again, I don't know the internal workings of Israel, whether or not they actually think this is a good idea or whether or not they're calling Hamas's bluff. But the platform that he's using is that, well, Hamas can't do it again. They can't do it again. Here's the problem with that. And here's why those two statements, Israel has the right to defend itself and Hamas can't do that again, are incompatible. One is because it can't be our line in the sand to decide whether or not Hamas is able to pull off another October 7th or they're not. It just can't work if you're also going to say that Israel has the right to defend itself. And I'll get into some of the reasoning as to why that is in a bit, but the bottom line is those two things don't work. If it's our line in the sand, then you can't definitively say that no, Israel has the right to do what they need to do to defend themselves. Because if you're going to go with that approach, you have to make it up to them. And again, I'll explain more in depth why I think it is up to them, and it has to be up to them in a second. The second thing is that also presents us with another problem in terms of support, whether it be weapons, aid, all of the different ways that the U.S. can support Israel. Let's back up. Let's zoom out. The best way to stop the killing and chaos is end the war. I realize that sounds obvious, but then that would mean the most humane thing to do is end the war quickly. And if you're trying to end the war quickly, what do you have to do? You have to win. William Tecumseh Sherman, general in the Civil War, was going down to Atlanta, on his way to sack Atlanta. The people of Atlanta wrote him a letter saying, please don't sack Atlanta. We have homes, we, made all of these cases as to why Sherman shouldn't go and just wreak havoc through Atlanta. Sherman responded with a letter, which I feel like is so poignant to this point in time, especially in this conflict in the Middle East. And he said, the best thing that we can do is end this war as quick as humanly possible. And of course, he's right. The best way to end the chaos, the suffering, the death is to end the war. And so, if you let up on the gas, especially when you have the upper hand, and this is kind of his statement made in more modern terms, but if you let up on the gas, all you're going to do is prolong the war. If you don't win, you have perpetuity of the war, which is worse for everybody. So Sherman makes the argument to the people of Atlanta saying, look, I sympathize with all of you. I don't want this all to happen, but the most humane thing to do here is to end the war. And the way that we end the war is we win the war. So I will not let up, he says to the people of Atlanta, until the war is won, because at the end of the day, this is better for everybody. And the way that that relates to Israel-Hamas is the best thing that can happen for everybody is this war ends. And the best way that the war ends is Israel definitively wins. As a supporter of Western civilization, I want that to be the outcome. And so regardless of what the Biden administration, what all these other countries around the world say in response to how Israel is winning the war, or how they would win the war, is seemingly irrelevant because it's up to them if, in fact, they do win. And it is in fact, over. And even if we decide to pull our support, that doesn't change the decision-making on their end. That just means they're going to do it in their own way. So it's kind of a conflict in Joe Biden's mind of, well, if you don't do what I want, I'm going to withhold these weapons. In Israel's mind, they're thinking, well, okay, I mean, I guess you can do that, but let's just take, for example, a more targeted missile system. We don't believe this war is over, so if you hold back the targeting weapon system, that doesn't help us end the war quicker, and conversely, it forces us to use dumb bombs, for lack of a better term. And the point I'm trying to make here is that the Biden administration holding back any sort of aid and support doesn't help Israel end the war, which is the most humane thing to do for everybody. The process here is what doesn't make sense, at least in my mind. And that brings us to this. In regards to support for Israel and whether or not the Biden administration is going to pull funding or weaponry or aid or whatever, remember, in this partnership, in this agreement, in this alliance, who is paying the higher cost? Clearly, in all of this is Israel. They're expending money, lives. They're sacrificing as a nation to ensure the fact that they win. So don't you think, wouldn't it make sense that Israel, in this conflict, of all of the nations that are giving input and suggestions and this, that, the other thing, don't you think that they're the ones that want to end this as quickly as possible? Wouldn't that make the most sense? Do you think Israel as a country, who again is sacrificing money, lives, resources, all of these things, do you think that they want this war to continue in perpetuity? No. If there's anybody who wants it to be over, it's Israel. As much as people on the outside of the conflict want to say, we want the war to be over, believe me, you don't want it to be over more than the Israelis. Because again, they are sacrificing more. So then, don't you think that they are going to be the first ones to declare it over if in fact they believe it to be over? They have the most incentive to do so. And considering the fact that they have the biggest incentive to end the war and end it as quickly as possible, given the sacrifices that they're making, don't you think they would? And don't you think that the outside input into this is seemingly irrelevant because the sacrifices that any of the other countries around that are supporting Israel are making don't even hold a candle to the sacrifices that Israel itself is making? And so because of that, don't you think they want to end the war more than you? Whoever you are, whatever nation state is giving input into this, believe me, you don't want this to be over more than the Israelis and the Israeli people. And because of that, you don't get to sit on your high horse and dictate, well, this should be this way, this should be this way, because I want it done. Trust me, they want it done more. Segment 3, Make-Believe Flag Controversy. This revolves around the Alito flying of the upside-down distressed flag. I'll assume that a lot of you know what I'm talking about here, but just a really quick and brief recap. Justice Alito was pictured outside of his house. He wasn't pictured, sorry. A flag was pictured being flown upside down at his house after the January 6th riots. I refuse to call it an insurrection because that's not what it was. Just vocabulary-wise, that's not what it was. There's a big whole story being made about this. At the end of the day, what it seems like is it ultimately comes down to a neighborhood dispute. One of the Alito neighbors in the neighborhood put up a flag that had some explicit language on it, and in response to that, Samuel Alito's wife, or at least he says, flew the flag upside down, a signal of distress. And now, 3 years later, the mainstream lefty media is saying, look at what the Supreme Court Justice did after the January 6th insurrection. Their words, not mine. They're also now, I guess, floating around another picture of a different flag that says Appeal to Heaven, which is like a John Locke quote. It doesn't matter. But in order to somewhat configure a way to tangentially attach a Supreme Court justice to crazy people that were being dumb on January 6th, and I'll say that they were being dumb, in order to conflate these, not conflate, but in order to connect these two pieces together, we're going to say this. It's all stupid and it's all ridiculous. First of all, you should know, if you don't know this story super well, apparently the Washington Post, I think by their own admission, said, yeah, they had this story back when it happened 3 years ago and didn't really think anything of it, and so they didn't run the story. And again, the Washington Post, if you don't know this, is not a conservative bastion of Trumpian MAGA beliefs. No, if they thought it was important or they thought it would help their side, they would have run the story then. But nevertheless, the story is getting a bunch of play. It's stupid because, again, it seems to be a neighborhood dispute admitted by everybody involved. It happened 3 years ago, and three, the last biggest point here is that if you're going to hold Justice Alito to some make-believe standard that, I don't know, he can't have his own political opinions or his wife can't have his own political opinions, all right, well then go ahead and hold your own to that. Because if you remember, in 2016, Ruth Bader Ginsburg gave speeches, made statements, I think in the Supreme Court specifically, that Trump was a faker. I think that was the big headline one, but also gave speeches talking about how bad Trump was. She donated money to Democrat campaigns. She clearly and unashamedly had her own political opinions. Did she recuse herself from any of the Trump campaigns? That's why, by the way, sorry, back up a little bit. I forgot to mention this. The whole reason here is to try to get Alito to recuse himself from any of the upcoming Trump either appeals or decisions that the Supreme Court has to make, which again is stupid because an outspoken Trump hater, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, RBG, didn't recuse herself from any of the cases that were brought before the Supreme Court in which Trump was involved. Now, before I just go and make those statements without giving any sort of background on it, 2018, Trump versus Hawaii. This case challenged the president's travel ban, which restricted entry into the United States from several, the quote-unquote Muslim ban, but from several countries that were deemed by the Obama administration to be dangerous. Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not recuse herself from that and was part of the justice in the dissenting view. Trump versus Vance, which is, we won't get into the specifics of all of these. Trump versus the Manzers USA LLP. Department of Homeland Security versus the Regents of the University of California system, another Trump case which Ruth Bader Ginsburg did not recuse herself, and the list goes on and on of all of these different cases that Trump was involved in after Ruth Bader Ginsburg said, well, Trump's a faker, I hate the guy, did not recuse herself. So the fact that she was so outspoken against Donald Trump and also then subsequently did not say, well, okay, I have a bias here, I don't want to insert my bias into these, and therefore I will recuse myself. The fact that she didn't do that, the idea then that a story that was not important enough to the Washington Post to publish 3 years ago when it happened is all of a sudden such a big deal that any upcoming Trump cases before the Supreme Court, well, Justice Alito clearly is not qualified or not of sound mind enough, not unbiased enough to make a decision here in this particular case, that argument is ridiculous. Like, absolutely outside the lines, ridiculous. Here's the problem, though, and this, I'll explain more of this in my final thoughts here, is that regardless of how ridiculous the story is, so many people are continuing to cover it. MSNBC, I was watching because, well, sometimes I watch MSNBC to punish myself for my sins. Force myself to watch that god-awful network. I believe it was Chris Hayes' show. Did 2 back-to-back segments on this make-believe fake flag controversy. And the idea of doing that, in my head, is so absurd that you have to bring yourself to ask, okay, well, why? Why are they doing this? Well, there's a couple reasons that they could be doing this. One is that their audience is so small that they're trying to pander to that audience in the desperate hopes to cling to that audience so that they don't go and, I don't know, become completely irrelevant because their audience has left them. Maybe that's the strategy of some of the cable news channels, CNN specifically, but MSNBC also, is that we will pander so hard to the little audience that we have left that we don't care if things are true or not, or they're actually a big deal, or what have you. We're just going to put it on our network because hopefully we can get some amount of ratings. And if that's the case, there are 2 things that can be said about the hosts that are willing to do that. Either one, they are dumber than we expect, but, you know, in giving any sort of latitude to those hosts. I don't think they're dumb. I don't think Rachel Maddow is dumb. I don't think Joy Reid is dumb. I don't think Chris Hayes is dumb. I don't think any of the other commentators they have on MSNBC are dumb. But that only leaves one other option. They're either dumb or they're lying. Which again, we'll talk more about this in the final thoughts, the fact that everybody's pretending all the time. So those could be the goals of the cable news channels. In the overall broader goal of the lefty agenda as a whole, the goal could be, well, exactly what they explicitly stated to be, is to destabilize the Supreme Court. For the first time in like 70 years, the Supreme Court leans to the right, a 6-3 conservative-leaning court. Now, we covered a story, I haven't been doing the show in a while, but I was on Real America's Voice with Steve Gruber talking about a story that the Supreme Court did not take up a case regarding gun rights. In other words, to call them an extreme MAGA court, okay, well, if that's the case, and they're not taking up some of the cases that I would like them to take up, as a person who I think is more pragmatist than anything, what does that make me? What does that make the people who look at this and go, yeah, this is I realize this is kind of a convoluted way of explaining what I'm trying to convey here. Here's what I'm saying. The Supreme Court is getting called all of these crazy names for the first time in a very long time. These right-wing extremist MAGA court, which again is hilarious considering some of the cases that they don't pick up. Off the top of my head, the Boise case talking about the constitutionality of one of the, I think it's a Fifth Court decision that says, well, Boise, and by default then the entire country, every city needs to have enough beds for the homeless people or else they can't enforce camping on the streets, urban camping, if you will. The Supreme Court didn't take that up, which again is crazy to me, but again, to call them a MAGA extremist court. They also didn't take up a gun case that I talked about on RAV last week. Bottom line here is calling them a MAGA extremist, right-wing fashion, whatever all of the big words that they use, to call them that is irrelevant and stupid. But still, they're trying to do it. Why? Well, I think they believe, from a bigger, broader umbrella lefty standpoint, is that if they can destabilize the Supreme Court, then they can enact a lot of the injustices that they're doing. We talked about the Trump case. If the left is successful in getting Americans to not believe in the Supreme Court, any of the appeals that would make its way all the way to the Supreme Court, in the Trump case, but also in any case, they can say, well, of course, the Supreme Court is just a MAGA agenda court that means absolutely nothing. And so for those reasons, the ratings reasons, the small audience reasons, trying to destabilize the authority of the Supreme Court, which is the last vestige of American federal institutions that anybody has really any faith in, and even then it's really still not that high. For those reasons are why people continually lie about this particular Alito story, but in a more broader sense, even pulling the Supreme Court out of it, is why people are lying about everything, which is what we're going to cover in the final thoughts. Final thoughts, everyone everywhere is playing pretend. One of my biggest irritations is unfortunately something I've also participated in, because trying to figure out this weird new kind of online culture and how to operate within it is an ongoing, never-ending task for me and people like me. But you, I'm sure, have seen people faking up emotions in order to react to a thing with the correct angles and the right lighting on social media. It's not something that is uncommon really at all. I'm sure you've seen somebody doing this particular act when you're scrolling through whatever social media you happen to go to. What you see is a lot of reaction videos. Let me give you in behind the scenes a little bit. most reaction videos, when I say most, I mean like 99% of reaction videos are all fake and all staged. And not necessarily fake as in they don't exist, it's that you see the video beforehand. Nobody, in most cases, is reacting blindly to things. In other words, it is not the first time you see it, and even if it is, the person that's reacting to that video of, somebody doing something crazy or something crazy happening knows that there's a camera in their face. Everybody knows who's making these videos that, well, one, chances are it's not the first time they actually saw it, so they know they have to amuse the crowd by feigning some emotion that's going to engage well with their audience. And two, the emotion that may actually genuinely be felt if in fact this is the first time they've seen this particular video footage is exaggerated, because that's what you do when a camera's on you. You exaggerate your hand motions. I don't do this as much in real life, probably with my hands, and I don't necessarily know, well, I did it again. It just happens organically. My point is that so many people, so often, especially on social media, are constantly playing pretend with their emotions. In these reaction videos, reacting to these stories, talking about these stories, and I'll openly admit it, I do it too. I try my best to not. I try more frequently to post, stand-up videos or videos I get from a speech or something like that, rather than just reacting to the viral clip of the day. Because at the end of the day, the behind-the-scenes account is that everybody doing them is to some extent pretending. I think, personally, that's not healthy for the people doing it, but also the viewer itself. And yet, people continue to do it, which brings us to the question as to why. Why do people continue to fake up or exaggerate real emotions when reacting to a story that would warrant probably some sort of disgust? Why is it that we have to performatively put on the act of being disgusted, right? When I read an article of something terrible happening, let's just say, for example, parents in a particular municipality lose the rights to their kids' medical information for one reason or other. That's a story that is disgusting. If I'm just reading that to myself, I am disgusted by it. That is an emotion that I genuinely have inside of me, but I'm just reading the article. I'm not, doing anything. But if I'm reading the article out loud in front of a camera, there is a performative component that comes into it, whether you like it or not. And again, whether I like it or not, that's just what happens. There is a performative element to this whole kind of media, internet dynamic, all the way up from, politics at the highest level. The president is performative in his politics. The vice president is performative in her politics. Political actors, we call them political actors, like they literally are actors, all the way down to the most infinitesimally significant reaction videos to something funny you have online. Everybody in every level here is performing to some extent. The question is to why? Why are they doing that? Well, the surfacey level answer to that is, well, because it gets views, it gets clicks, it works to an extent. I've seen it work. I understand responses to things, but blind reactions to a, again, viral video in which you're intently watching the video and then the facial emotion and the reaction, and then you look at the camera and then you go, I cannot believe that happened. I get it. Like I said, I've done those videos, but it doesn't make them any less weird. I feel weird doing them. I feel weird editing them and cutting them. And I know that all my friends who do that same thing, and I'm not necessarily trying to knock them for doing it, because at the end of the day, it does work, feel weird. We all feel weird doing it. But why? Why then do they continue doing it? Well, again, because it works. Then you have to ask the question, well, why does it work? And I think the reason it works is actually a pretty important facet of our culture that we need to understand better if we want to turn the culture in the direction that we want to turn it. It is a way of thought that has been used for centuries. It is not a new thought, but in the modern world, Ben Shapiro is credited with saying facts don't care about your feelings. And when he made that statement, and that statement went viral, I don't think he was not nearly the big a deal he was that he is today, but people loved it because it's true. Facts don't care about your feelings. Here's the caveat, and here's the addition probably to that statement, because I believe that statement wholeheartedly. Here's the addition to that statement that I think conservatives need to know and need to recognize, especially going forward in this modern day and age. Facts don't care about your feelings, but elections do. In other words, people vote based on their emotions. And people like feeling emotions. And when you're scrolling through Instagram or TikTok or YouTube Shorts or Twitter or Facebook or whatever your social media platform of choice, you want to feel an emotion. And the reason creators do reaction videos is to convey their emotion onto you. And in a way, there's this sort of symbiotic relationship that's built between the viewer and the creator by conveying an emotion that is simultaneously felt by the person performing the emotion and the person receiving the emotion. That's why reaction videos work, is that emotions exist. Facts don't care about your feelings, but feelings have a big impact on how somebody acts and how somebody behaves. We win on all of the facts. That just goes without saying. Our ideas are better because they're grounded in things that are more truthful than a lot of your liberal ideas. But liberals are better at winning on cultural grounds because they appeal solely to emotions. Now, while I think it's a good thing to argue on the merits of an idea and how it would actually affect a society that it's going to govern, we should debate laws by how it's going to work in reality. There also is this component of emotion that we so often neglect. And we can prove it exists by how popular those reaction videos are when you're scrolling through social media platforms. Those reaction videos and the success that they have prove that the emotion component exists, and it exists at a level that I don't think I even want to admit. And even when we're making better arguments and making better cases for our ideas based in reality and truth and fact, we do ourselves a disservice to completely neglect the emotional component that everybody has. So, in the end and in culmination, and the final thought here is, in the Trump situation going on there, where people are make-believe pretending that this is a big deal, and it is a big deal from a cultural standpoint, but the case itself just factually is not, to the Israel-Hamas war, where people are getting so worked up with their emotions, to the Alito flag, which is the mainstream media pretending that something is real and using emotions to justify what they believe is the correct course. With all of that encompassing in how we navigate through the changing of culture, we do ourselves a disservice to neglect emotion. Conservatives need to neglect emotion at their own peril. And my hope is that while we continue to make the rational, logical arguments that we've always made, we also make sure to help satisfy the emotional component by way of reason even, but through arts and through comedy, through music. We need to infect the emotional component the same way the lefties do, so that we can not only have the rational and logical arguments, but also the emotional ability to compel people to do what is right and do what is just. Before we end, I realized at the beginning I promised I would talk about where we've been for the last couple months. And by we, I mean I, because it was entirely my decision to just stop doing the show. There was no butting heads with anybody. I just woke up one morning and said, nah. And here's where I think that came from. In the beginning of doing like a live show, thankfully the Daily Caller people, the folks over Daily Caller, had enough trust and confidence in me to do a daily morning show. And I did that for, almost 3 years, 2.5 years. And at the beginning, I put a lot of effort into it. I wake up pretty early because I'm on the West Coast, and that thing aired at 11 a.m. on the East Coast, which was 8 a.m. for me. So I was up pretty early, kind of going through stories, making out my whole diagram thing that I would use for the show. And as I did it over several months, what I noticed was myself kind of falling into a routine and putting less and less thought behind the show itself and therefore inevitably the things that I was saying. And that's not necessarily that I disagreed with the things that I was saying. I just was more flying by the seat of my pants. At the beginning, I had this full rundown of show that would go from the topic to the points we were going to make and all that stuff. And kind of as it became more, I became more used to doing it, I just stopped doing that. Earlier this year, January 2024, I was waking up in the morning, I'd go on Twitter, I'd find, libs of TikTok, what's a video that they posted of some crazy lefties doing some crazy stuff, and I'd just play the video and we'd talk about it for a little bit, and that was that. And I think ultimately, it wasn't that wasn't dissatisfying, because I think those videos need to be seen, but I didn't feel like it was actually doing anything. Like, yeah, it was, monetizing, I guess, and bringing in some money, but this isn't where I make the gist of my income for the year, and so I don't know, I wasn't really like emotionally invested into doing it. And so one day I woke up and I was like, what are we doing? What am I doing? We're just getting online for a half an hour, going live, doing exactly what I said in the final thought, acting like I'm upset about something, and I am upset about it, but I'm doing this performative piece that isn't as well thought out as I'd like it to be. And I feel like I'm doing myself a disservice to just turn the camera on and go live without really any thought put into it. I'm doing myself a disservice, but I'm doing all of you people a disservice too. And so one day I just got up and thought, what is the point of this? And I kind of stuck to the live events. I spent this whole spring on tour with Charlie Kirk and Candace Owens, which, gosh, that is such a privilege to get to do. Thank you to Turning Point and Charlie and all the people over there who make that possible. But that's where I really feel like, my presence/ability is best able to kind of convey a message in a way that I like to convey it, kind of a thought-out, meticulous, hopefully funny presentation of the ideas and things that I believe. And so I spent most of the spring doing that before kind of settling into, all right, I still want to comment on things that are going on in the world, but I can't do it the way that I was doing it, because it was a big nothing. And that's not to say that this won't go back to being a live everyday show, but the budget would have to increase dramatically, so please like and share. But all that being said, it just wasn't something that I wanted to do the way I was doing it. So I thought a lot about it, and I kind of thought to myself, I'll just do periodic episodes. I don't know. I don't know how often we're going to do this. It might be once a week. It could be once every other week. It could be 3 times a week. Who knows? Depends on what's going on in the world. But if I'm going to do an episode of this show, I'd like it to be more thought out, more measured, more templated, and hopefully dive in a little bit deeper than the base surface line of like, oh, look at how dumb this woke person is. Because I think there's all too much of that in the commentary world today. So with that, I appreciate you watching. We'll be back whenever we're back. Hopefully you'll tune in then. Go find the podcast on whatever podcast platform you listen to. It'll be on YouTube, Facebook, Rumble. I don't know if we'll upload this entire thing to Twitter. We'll see. But appreciate you doing so. See you then next time, whenever next time will be. Until then, God bless America. Actually, not until then. In perpetuity, God bless America.